seeking answers. New developments in the search for a vaccine for the coronavirus. Rising tensions. The feud is starting to escalate between the United States and China. Arson attack. Officials in France have an update on the burning of a Catholic cathedral earlier this month. And committed to holiness. Pope Francis tells the faithful how to avoid leading a mediocre life. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, July 27th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. We begin now with promising news in the fight against the coronavirus. The world's biggest COVID-19 vaccine study just launched today. 30,000 volunteers will be administered shots created in conjunction with the U.S. government, all part of the White House's Operation Warp Speed. Correspondent Owen Jensen reports from the White House. Owen?
Tracy, President Trump and Vice President Pence traveled to different parts of the country today to update Americans on the intense and vital race for a vaccine.
President Donald Trump traveled to a biotech company in North Carolina to check out the progress being made against the pandemic.
I just had a meeting on vaccines and therapeutics, and it was a great meeting. We had a lot of our wonderful doctors and researchers with me. We're doing well on vaccines. We're doing well on therapeutics.
And in Florida, Vice President Mike Pence, the head of the coronavirus task force, getting his own update at a roundtable at the University of Miami Medical School.
The president called it Operation Warp Speed, and that's the speed at which we're moving to develop a vaccine.
That was not bad at all.
You hardly good.
Just today in Georgia, a phase 3 study of Moderna's experimental vaccine was launched. Volunteers either received a real shot or a placebo.
I'm okay with not knowing. You know, in reality, there's a lot of things we don't know. Who knew that this would be happening, a year ago?
In the U.S., more than 4 million have been infected, according to Johns Hopkins. Among them, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien.
Robert O'Brien is a dear friend of mine, a wonderful colleague to work with. I'm sure he'll get through this with Godspeed.
And earlier today, the president gave the thumbs up to another effort to save lives as he welcomed to the White House walking Marine Terry Sharp, who's raising awareness about veteran suicide.
And sadly and tragically, 22 veterans claim their own lives every day. As for the vaccine, it's going to take months before we get results. And the vice president says if you'd like to take part in a study, be involved in a study, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov. That's clinicaltrials.gov. Tracy?
Okay, thank you, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. Democratic lawmakers in Washington are calling for their Republican colleagues to release details on the Senate's next plan for COVID-19 aid relief. And after a weekend of intense meetings, Republicans say they're getting close. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, Republicans have been hard at work working throughout the weekend on a proposal to help meet America's needs. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, along with her colleague, Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, argue that the Republicans are in disarray, and they say the GOP plan that they worked out with the White House is insufficient.
The Republicans have had the HEROES Act for over 2 months, sitting there in their chamber. Why would you wait until people are to the point of running out of their benefits?
Democrats say Republicans have run out of time. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi writes today, quote, I call upon the Republican leadership of the House and Senate and representatives of the president to come to the Speaker's office and join Leader Schumer and me within a half an hour of releasing their plan today to negotiate. Republicans say their bill would include a drop in the additional money for the unemployed.
If it's 200 rather than 600, at least it gives them 200 more over and on top of what they're going to get for their under their state unemployment benefits.
The GOP aid proposal also includes a second round of stimulus checks directly to Americans and $105 billion for K-12 schools.
There's also a provision in the bill that I will be introducing about school choice. About 10% of the funds for schools would go to private schools because 10% of the children, about 5.7 million children, go to private schools, so they'd get their fair share of the money.
They're negotiating to prevent money from going to areas that should not receive it.
We're going to pay for Planned Parenthood, which we would never vote for that stuff up here. But now we're just putting in their state, giving them the money through, giving them flexibility on the $150 billion. And by the way, these states won't even respond to tell us how they've spent the money, which infuriates me.
And speaking of Planned Parenthood, Republican Congresswoman Debbie Lesko out of Arizona introduced a bill today. It's called the PPP Integrity Act. If passed, it would require Planned Parenthood affiliates to pay back all the money that they receive from PPP loans. At last check, it was at least $150 million. Tracy?
Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill tonight. Thanks so much, Eric. Lawmakers are paying tribute to the late Congressman John Lewis. The coffin of the civil rights icon arrived on Capitol Hill today after touring several D.C. landmarks. Lawmakers from the Republican and Democratic parties remembered Lewis, his career, and his legacy. There also was a rendition of Amazing Grace. People gathered along the route in and around the nation's capital to pay their respects. The funeral is set for Thursday in Atlanta. Tensions between the United States and China are putting trade at risk, and relations are not improving. Police in China closed off several blocks around the U.S. consulate that was ordered closed last week. It is located in the western city of Chengdu. It was shut down in retaliation for the U.S. ordering the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston. Officials in Hong Kong are again increasing virus rules as cases continue to grow. The updated restrictions include social gatherings limited to only 2 people, and restaurants must now stop dine-in services. The restrictions are in response to a new community outbreak of COVID-19. However, a full lockdown of Hong Kong is not yet in place. The head of the World Health Organization warns the coronavirus pandemic is still getting worse.
Almost 16 million cases have now been reported to WHO, and more than 640,000 deaths. And the pandemic continues to accelerate. In the past 6 weeks, the total
Dr. Tedros also says that he will convene the WHO's emergency committee on Thursday. It is a procedural requirement 6 months after the pandemic was declared a public health emergency. Israel is undergoing a public outcry, generating a wave of demonstrations against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his perceived failure to handle the country's deepening economic crisis. The protests have continued for 2 months now.
I feel a lot of love here, a lot of good people. They're just feeling that something wrong is going on.
Many Israelis are not happy with the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis, and an economic downturn has spurred a younger generation of Israelis to worry about their future. Churches in Mexico City were open for Mass today. They were the first services in 3 months following a lockdown for the coronavirus pandemic. Several protective measures were in place, including social distancing and taking the temperature of each attendee. Police in France investigating last week's fire at the cathedral in Nantes say it was an inside job. A 39-year-old church volunteer from Rwanda has admitted to starting the fire. He was in charge of locking up the cathedral and told investigators that he started 3 fires earlier in the month. The fire badly damaged the 15th century Gothic cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul. He faces 10 years in prison. Pope Francis says that he welcomes the news of a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. Fighting between the rebel forces and the Ukrainian army began back in 2014. The Vatican has been following this situation very closely, and joining us now with more insight on it is Andrea Galliaducci, Vatican analyst for EWTN News. Andrea, so good to see you again. So what does the Ukrainian ceasefire agreement say, and why is the Vatican following this situation so closely?
Well, the ceasefire said that all the conflicts, all the exchange of fires had to stop by midnight last night, by midnight of the 27th of July. And so it was kind of an impromptu agreement. Nobody was expecting it anymore. but he came out from the trilateral group, and that's why Pope Francis mentioned it at the Angelus, because the Vatican has been following the situation very closely, because the Church has been very much involved in helping the population down in Ukraine, not only for the Maidan, for the manifestations that were in Kiev, but also to help the people that were left homeless or with no support in the Donbas and Luhansk regions, which are the places where there is still the conflict ongoing.
I know that Pope Francis expressed his appreciation yesterday. What exactly did he say regarding the agreement?
Well, Pope Francis appreciated the agreement, and he asked that the Donbas region was going to be disarmed and to give peace to the population. It's the last step of many things that Pope Francis did for Ukraine. Not later than last year, Pope Francis also summoned all the Greek Catholic bishops from Ukraine to talk about the Ukrainian situations in the Vatican for a so-called interdicasterial meeting. So Pope Francis was very appreciating it, but now the issue is if the ceasefire will stay.
Andrea, what else has the Vatican done to help the situation there in the Ukraine?
Well, back in 2016, Pope Francis called a special collection for Ukraine. It was a huge collection all over the world. All the churches from all over the world collected money to send them to Ukraine. Then the Pope set up a committee, and this committee issued a series of projects to help the population in Ukraine, both the poor, the people that were left homeless, also people that needed psychological support. And it was a sort of new kind of help because it was done also with the support of other kind of organizations, not just Catholic relief services. Then two cardinals went to Ukraine. Cardinal Parolin and Cardinal Sandri went there, both for the Secretariat of State and for the Eastern churches. During these days, there is Cardinal Krajewski, the papal almoner, that was invited by the Latin Rite Bishops' Conference of Ukraine to see the situation. So there have been a lot of initiatives, and also the papal nuncio, Gugerotti, that now has been sent to the UK, but has been in Ukraine until last month, has been many times into the conflict area.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for coming on today. We always appreciate you and your analysis. Andrea Galeoducci, Vatican analyst for EWTN News. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Coming up, analysis of an attempt by some Democrats to hamper the pro-life Hyde Amendment. Plus, more reaction to the decision by Turkey to turn a longtime cathedral back into a mosque. Three Democratic congresswomen are trying to strike the pro-life Hyde Amendment, which prohibits public funding of abortions through Medicaid reimbursements, from a 2021 appropriations bill. In a statement, Representative Ayanna Pressley, Democrat from Massachusetts and one of the lawmakers sponsoring the move, writes in part, quote, "The Hyde Amendment is a racist, discriminatory policy that has perpetuated inequity and injustice in our nation for far too long." Joining me now on Skype to talk more about the Hyde Amendment and its pro-life impact is Michael New, Associate Scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute and visiting assistant professor at the Catholic University of America. Michael, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first off, I'd like to get your reaction to Congresswoman Presley's claim that the Hyde Amendment targets women of color. What do you think, and what does your research show?
Well, the Hyde Amendment doesn't target anybody. The Hyde Amendment protects people. There's a very good body of research that shows when you quit funding abortion with taxpayer dollars, abortion numbers go down. And there's a considerable body of research that shows that the Hyde Amendment has saved millions of lives. My own study for the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which I updated recently, has found that the Hyde Amendment has saved over 2.4 million lives since 1976. And those are millions of people walking around today who owe their lives to the Hyde Amendment, and millions of women who've been spared a lifetime of regret because of Hyde. So the Hyde doesn't target anybody, it protects people.
Michael, let's talk a little bit more about the Hyde Amendment's history. And at one point, it did receive bipartisan support, but it doesn't appear to be the case today. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting. I mean, you're right. The Hyde Amendment was a lot more bipartisan. When the Hyde Amendment was first voted on in 1976, it received the support of around 107 congressional Democrats. As recently as 1993, it received the support of 98 House Democrats. Now things have changed. The demographics of the Democratic Party have changed. It used to be a lot of Democrats who came of age either during the Great Depression or World War II, and these Democrats tend to be a little more liberal on economic issues, but socially conservative. This generation of Democrats is largely kind of dying out and being replaced with a younger generation tends to be a lot more liberal and a lot more aggressive on these social issues. So many Democrats have sadly changed their position. Joe Biden, throughout most of his Senate career, supported the Hyde Amendment. Last year, as a presidential candidate, he now announced that he opposes the Hyde Amendment. So again, I don't think this is smart politics for the Democratic Party. Most polls show that people oppose seeing their taxpayer dollars go to fund elective abortions. So again, it's become a partisan issue, and I think that's regrettable.
Yeah, the amendment to remove the Hyde language was introduced late last week. What are the next steps?
Well, I think next steps are that Senate Republicans need to state very clearly that they're only going to pass an appropriations bill with Hyde protections. President Trump should make a very clear statement that he'll veto any appropriations bill that does not include Hyde language. Down the road, there have been efforts to kind of codify the Hyde Amendment so we don't have to pass it every year. But the most important thing we can do is keep electing pro-life people to the House, the Senate, and the presidency. If we have a pro-life House, a pro-life Senate, and a pro-life president, the Hyde Amendment will be secure.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on. We always appreciate your analysis. Michael New, Associate Scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute and Visiting Assistant Professor at the Catholic University of America. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Orthodox and other Christians continue to mourn the loss of a historic holy site in Turkey. Hagia Sophia once served as one of Christendom's most significant cathedrals. Now it's been converted back to a mosque. Correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Tracy, the religious history of Hagia Sophia goes all the way back to the 6th century. It was built as a cathedral, later turned into a mosque, and for more than 85 years it had been functioning as a museum. Until now, it's been converted back into a mosque. Still, Christians are protesting that decision.
Save Hagia Sophia! Save Hagia Sophia!
Protesters outside the Turkish embassy in Washington over the weekend, condemning the decision by Turkey's government to turn Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque. Though the historic religious site officially opened for Muslim prayer Friday, this protester argues it should remain a Greek Orthodox cathedral.
Hagia Sophia was built as a church, and it should be operated as a church. The Turkish compromise of making it a museum and then the conversion of it into a mosque is disastrous.
Turkey's president joined in the Muslim prayer service Friday following his decree earlier this month to convert Hagia Sophia back into a mosque.
I knew that this was coming.
Mustafa Akyol disagreed with President Erdogan's decision. He's a senior fellow with the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., Turkish journalist and Muslim himself. Akyol says it's unlikely to happen anytime soon, but Hagia Sophia could one day be claimed as a site of worship for both Muslims and Christians.
A Hagia Sophia where, yes, Muslims keep praying, but on Sundays, we're giving the upper gallery where you have Christ and Mary very visible to the Christians, so let them have Mass.
Dr. Elizabeth Prodromo, an expert on geopolitics and religion, is concerned President Erdogan's actions are having negative consequences for more than just religious minorities.
I think we have issues of grave geopolitical concern for the international community when it comes to Turkey's rogue state behaviors.
Earlier this month, Pope Francis weighed in on the conversion of this religious site back into a mosque. The Holy Father said, "I think of Hagia Sophia and I am very saddened." Tracy?
Correspondent Mark Irons reporting for us tonight. Thanks so much, Mark. A legendary TV personality, Regis Philbin, died over the weekend, a month shy of his 89th birthday.
Thank you very much for these great years together. God bless you all, and I hope I see you again real soon.
And that was a clip from his final Live. Regis was a household name for decades as host of Live with Regis and Kathy Lee, later Regis and Kelly. He also hosted Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, among other shows. Regis Philbin grew up in the Bronx, New York. He was actually named after the Catholic high school that his father attended. Philbin went to Notre Dame University and was an enthusiastic alum. He credited his years in Catholic education for the man he became. Philbin logged nearly 17,000 hours on the air, earning him recognition in the Guinness Book of World Records. He is survived by his wife Joy and 3 daughters. Up next, Pope Francis delivers a message about the importance of grandparents. We'll explain. Pope Francis asked young people to send a hug to their grandparents and to make sure they are not alone during the coronavirus pandemic.
Loro sono le vostre radici.
At a Sunday talk with pilgrims at the Vatican and on the feast of Saints Joachim and Anne, the grandparents of Christ, the Holy Father also encouraged the faithful to not live mediocre lives. He says we can avoid it by committing ourselves to the adventure of holiness and in discovering all the ways to love God and spread joy to others. A new campaign by Students for Life of America is adding pressure to the growing calls for statues and symbols of the founder of Planned Parenthood to be removed. Kristan Hawkins, the group's president, makes the case, writing in part, quote, for those identifying historical figures with racist roots who should be removed from public view because of their evil histories, Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger, must join that list. And Kristan Hawkins joins me now on Skype. Kristan, so good to have you on the show again. Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So as you know, last week, Margaret Sanger's name was removed from Planned Parenthood of Greater New York's Manhattan office. However, there are still images of her in places of honor, like the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. I know that you have said that needs to change immediately. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. That is why we launched Strike Out Sanger, and folks can go to strikeoutsanger.com right now and write to the Smithsonian. They can write the mayor of New York City as well as the mayor of Boston, some of these central places where Margaret Sanger is still today being honored. You know, this is what the pro-life movement has been saying for decades, that Planned Parenthood was founded in racism. Not only did their racism, launch the organization, they today still practice racism when 4 out of 5 of their abortion facilities are within walking distance from urban minority communities, when 38% of all their abortions are committed on African American women, when African Americans make up 13% of our population. This is clearly a past and present situation, and this is really only a starting point. It's kind of for us interesting to see some Planned Parenthood workers there in New York who are now acknowledging Planned Parenthood's racist past, but it's not enough just to acknowledge the racist past. It's now time for them to confront their racist present.
Can you talk a little bit more about this new campaign that you have, SOS, Strike Out Sanger, and what do you hope to accomplish by launching it?
Sure. Well, we hope that the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian, will remove Margaret Sanger's bust. We hope that the New York City mayor will strike out Margaret Sanger's name from Margaret Sanger Square there in Manhattan. And we hope that Margaret Sanger's statue is removed from the Freedom Trail, which is there in Boston, to remember the Revolutionary War heroes, the founders of our country, to remove her statue from that location as well. You know, this is an interesting time in American politics and what we see going on across the country. And one thing is very clear. This is an organization that was founded on the institution of racism, that birth control and abortion were solutions, proposed solutions to those who Margaret Sanger and her friends deemed as unfit, unworthy. This is the very opposite of valuing human beings and valuing the true worth and dignity of every human being. And Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood should never be honored anywhere in our nation's history, regardless of whether that's the Smithsonian or in Manhattan or in Boston. And we can talk about our history, but she doesn't need to be honored in this way.
Oh, Kristan, thank you so much for coming on. We always appreciate you having you here on the show. Kristan Hawkins, president of Students for Life of America. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
And finally tonight, the mayors of New York City and Washington, D.C. had the words Black Lives Matter painted on city streets, and it gave a pro-lifer an idea. Taylor Hanson is painting the words Baby Lives Matter in front of Planned Parenthood clinics. This one is in Washington, D.C. Hanson is founder of the Baby Lives Matter movement. He also painted Baby Lives Matter at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Salt Lake City. Planned Parenthood is the nation's largest abortion provider. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We leave you tonight with the Amazing Grace from the Capitol Hill service from Representative John Lewis. Good night and God bless.
Many dangers, toils and snares I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me